Welcome to the off script interview on Basis Point Insight. Today we are tackling a critical issue that's shaking up global economies. Trade, to be specific. US President Donald Trump's aggressive tariff measures. Amid sweeping duties, some skewed maths, erratic flip flops, and a confrontational approach to international commerce, the trade landscape is once again in a flux, and the stakes are high for economies worldwide. For India, this presents both risks and opportunities. Can we capitalize on the China plus one strategy? Will Make in India finally gain momentum? Or will we find ourselves caught in the crossfire of another global trade conflict? Joining us today to unbox these developments is Mr. Vivek Johri, former chairman of the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs, currently a senior advisor indirect taxes at KPMG India. So, without much ado, we'll straight start into the interview. Mr. Jory, welcome. And you will be sharing your views with us in your personal capacity and shed light on what's at stake for India in these uncertain times and how best can we navigate the issue. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Jory.
Thank you so much, Ranjana. Good morning to you and all your viewers.
Good morning. So, President Trump's return has brought back the kind of aggressive tariff playbook we saw during his first term vis a vis China. So, there are blanket duties on imports, threats of even steeper levies, a flurry of policy reversals, including, a 90-day suspension of some orders. And China has hit back with its own measures. So, how do you interpret this turbulence in trade? Is it some kind of a strategic posturing, or are we heading into a deeper and more unpredictable phase of trade conflict?
Thank you. Let me go back a little bit in history and talk about um, the disenchantment which I have been observing, um, of some WTO members, particularly the US, with the rule-based trading system, the way they perceived it. There were two very clear narratives which began somewhere in the mid 2015 or so, at the WTO. One of them had to do, and it was mainly, piloted by the American delegation there. The first one had to do with the manner in which the dispute settlement body of the WTO and the appellate mechanism was working. And it was their perception that it was not working in the interest of all WTO members. And so they wanted, a complete sort of reconfiguration of the dispute settlement mechanism. Now, as you would immediately understand, Ranjana, the dispute settlement mechanism is what sets the WTO apart from the rest of UN bodies and multilateral organizations, because that is what provides teeth to the rule-based system. So the dispute settlement mechanism itself started getting weakened at that time because of lack of consensus in the appointment of members to dispute settlement bodies, and this entire debate about redefining the rules on the basis of which that body works. I think that was the starting point. The second narrative which began at the WTO at that time was the graduation debate. If you recall, under the WTO rules, developing countries are entitled to special and differential treatment. And all WTO agreements and negotiations conform to that principle, which means developing countries have a right under the WTO rules to be treated more leniently vis-a-vis developed countries. When it comes to setting rules, they're given longer phase-in periods. They're given, other kind of concessions when it comes to application of WTO agreements to them. And there are many instances of that. But some of the developed countries, particularly the US, began what is known as the graduation debate, where they said some of the developing countries, particularly the emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, and others, should now graduate and not be entitled to special and differential treatment.
Okay.
So that was the second leg of the debate which began at the WTO at that time. And the way I see it, uh, Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 now is a culmination of those developments. So the attempt is to put in place a mechanism which is an alternative to the WTO rules. And by by imposing tariffs, as they've done now, on a whole swathe of countries in this round, unlike the past one, um, the US has wrested control over the narrative. And so when you ask me whether it is strategic, yes, it is strategic because it compels trading partners to come to the negotiation table or to respond, like China's done, retaliation, or EU threatening to do. But most of the trading members, partners of the US, have agreed to negotiate. So I think they have precipitated the debate and the narrative by announcing, these tariffs, which were way beyond levels that people expected them to be, and you know that makes it even more compelling, particularly for certain countries, and we'll discuss why and what it is that way. But yes, so it is a mix of strategic, with posturing. In terms of implication, the implications, of course, are very serious. And for India, for instance, with the US is the largest trading partner. 18% of our exports find their way to the US. And it's the fourth largest import partner of India. So we also import substantially from the US. There is uncertainty. We don't know which way, these tariffs will turn out. The moratorium is 90 days now. Will it get extended? Um, the uncertainty also stems from the fact that there is, competition amongst the trading partners of the US. Um, we don't know who will be the first past the post when it comes to, settling this matter with the US through a free trade agreement or, through concessions that are offered. Um, Trade equations around the world will definitely be redefined. Global value chains will have to be reconfigured. It has macroeconomic implications in terms of what it does to exchange rates, to rates of interest, capital flows across the world, and so on and so forth. So the implications, of course, are very, very large, and um, the objective of the exercise is also a little unclear yet. To begin with, the Trump administration had taken a position that two things. One, the objective is to balance trade because these are all trading partners with whom they run a trade deficit. The US runs a trade deficit with these trading partners. With some, it's huge, like China. With the others, it's not so big, but still, it seems to be a concern for the US. And the way the tariffs have been determined, uh, at least the math behind it, as they have put it out, seems to be one which, in their view, will bridge the gap and close the deficit. Now, whether that's going to happen or not is anybody's guess because the deficit is not just reliant on tariffs; it's reliant on many other things. Um, so, the order and the scale at which this has happened is unprecedented, and obviously that has very grave implications for the global economy. Um, who's able to strike a deal first, how trade equations change, how interstate competitiveness of these countries changes. These are all issues which we need to look at. Then, but there are at least one you know one implication which is very clear, which is that we're moving away from multilateralism to plurilateralism. This was another trend which we witnessed at the WTO. You've had plurilateral agreements on the side. on government procurement, for example, on IT2, for example, ITA. But now, because of this development, people are looking for alternative markets. Countries are looking for alternative markets, and there's a greater possibility of going in for, new trade agreements, which are regional, which are more complementary in nature, maybe shorter global value chains. So there are a lot of implications.
So you do see, a good window of opportunity, and also, the risks that come. You can get caught in the middle of global supply chain shocks, etc. Right?
For India, I see it as an opportunity,
Mhm.
and I'll give the reason. One of the things that strikes me is that, let me begin with tariffs first. So, unlike many other, of our competitors in Southeast Asia, the good news is that we have enough tariff cushion available to use as negotiating capital with the US. So, what we were being criticized for may actually turn out to be a virtue when it comes to negotiating with the US, because our tariff levels are high vis-a-vis many other countries who are in the fray for, concluding agreements with the US, and therefore our ability to give on tariffs is much more. That's the first point. The implication of that is that you may be able to strike a deal which does not spill over in a very big way into other areas of trade. Even though the US has expressed concerns, if you look at the National Trade Estimates report of 2025, the USTR, which has just been turned in, there are concerns in many areas vis-a-vis, India, in the report. So there are concerns about, technical technical barriers to trade, the way in which those are applied, quality control orders, price control on drugs and medical devices, also the IPR regime, uh, the way import licensing works, the uncertainty of tariffs and how they change from time to time, the tariff cushion we have in agriculture. So there are many issues that have been listed in the USTR report. Services and market access for services. Um, if you're able to, because the debate currently is only about tariffs, and if you're able to confine, uh, although you may not be, but in my view, the spillover effect to other areas may not be so big because you have the ability to negotiate well on tariffs and you have a lot of negotiating capital. That's one point. Secondly, why I think it's an opportunity is because the kind of changes and policy reform that you need to bring about in the country, it fits very well with what you already have promised yourself by way of Viksit Bharat and, Make in India. So Viksit Bharat, if it has to achieve the kind of rates of growth that we're talking about, and please remember that it's predicated strongly on export growth. So if that is one of the objectives of Viksit Bharat and, one of the means of getting there, then what you need to do vis-a-vis the US tariffs and our trade policy is similar to what so there is a policy fit that I see. The third thing which works in our favor is that the damage for us may not be that big because our export concentration, as the ratio of exports to GDP is not as high as many of the competitors, that have been impacted by these tariffs. So, we have an export concentration ratio which is much lower compared to Vietnam, compared to other Southeast Asian countries. And also in terms of concentration by destination of our exports is not so strong. The fourth thing which goes in our favor is that we're already at an advanced stage of negotiations on FTAs with the EU and UK at least, and there are many other. Canada was, of course, the talks were suspended at one point in time, but we're trying to grow the agreement with Australia. And there are many other on the anvil. So, with that, our ability to tap into other markets to overcome whatever losses we incur or whatever uncertainties we face because of US tariffs is that much better. And in my view, if the government were to expedite those negotiations, as they've been trying to do, and we were able to conclude them in in the short or medium term, that will again work in our favor. So these are the many things, because of which I feel it's an opportunity. There are many challenges, with regard to our global competitiveness, and many commentators who are far more competent to sort of talk about this have given various suggestions. How can we reduce the cost of finance in India? How can we improve labor productivity in India to improve our competitiveness? But those are also things that we need to. So those are the challenges we might face.
Yeah, I think you've covered most of what I'm going to come up with next. But let's do it like a SWOT. If we had to step back and look at the landscape strategically, how would you assess India's current position through a SWOT lens? Are our strength like we have a large labor pool and we have a very strong digital infrastructure? Are these strengths enough to seize this opportunity, or are we still held back by our structural weaknesses, the compliance burdens, and logistics gaps?
I think we are. So the opportunities I've already spelled out.
Yeah.
But in terms of challenges, I think one of the biggest challenges we face, two in fact, one is the regulatory cholesterol, which has already been talked about. The government
Yes.
has also clarified its intent on how the states also need to work on reducing the regulatory cholesterol. Um, when you talk to investors from abroad who want to invest in India, the big concern they have is one, the regulatory cholesterol, and two, the uncertainty they face with regard to taxes. And we talked, there are issues with regard to taxation and how tax disputes are resolved, etc. Um, so those are some of the challenges, but the bigger challenge is more long term. Is Has to do with labor productivity, in my view, because there's a lot of work to be done on improving labor productivity in India. There are studies that show that it has not grown at the pace at which many of the leading exporters of the world and even middle income and emerging economies have witnessed. And therefore, we need to work very hard on labor productivity, which in turn has to do with skilling and our education system, etc. So these are the long-term challenges. Infrastructure used to be a challenge in the past, but there have been very, very major strides that India has made, both in terms of improving its road infrastructure, uh, travel, movement of cargo, revamping of ports, airports, air cargo complexes. Of course, that work is ongoing, but quite a lot of work on that has already happened, which has brought down the logistics costs. And the implementation of GST has also reduced the logistics costs in the country. So, but there are challenges, like I mentioned, on factor markets, on labor, and so on.
So, what, in your opinion, are the low-hanging fruits India can quickly act on to improve its global competitiveness, in the shifting scenario?
Some of the, I think that has a sectoral dimension, because if you're talking about um, trade with the US, for example, there's a certain export basket that we have been trading with the US on, and some of the sectors we are better poised to deal with. And I have in mind things like smartphones, pharma, and textiles and apparel. Those are the three sectors I feel where we can occupy some of the space that our competitors may vacate, owing to the tariff that have been imposed by the U.S. administration. But in some other sectors, we may have to step back a little, and those could be auto components, which now attract a tariff of 25%. Chemicals, aluminum. And I'm talking on the basis of analysis that I've read. So I think there's a sectoral dimension to what we can achieve in the short run with regard to US tariffs.
Uh, we've been hearing about the China plus one strategy. We've heard this for years. But the tariff escalations could force companies to act faster. Is India realistically poised to attract this manufacturing shift, especially when you compare with Vietnam, Mexico, or Indonesia? And what are we getting right, and what's holding us back?
See, one of the factors, Ranjana, which is not so much talked about and which we need to reckon with is what are the rules of origin that the US is going to apply as and when, the moratorium gets over and, differentiated tariffs
Hmm.
operation. Because the opportunities, frankly, are dependent on how the rules of origin are defined. Um, in my view, if you have an economy that uh, is intricately sort of wedded to global value chains or integrated well with global value chains, but um, in terms of value add, the integration is not very high. Um, because certain goods come in for processing, they go back to another trading partner, and from there some more processing is done, they're exported to the US. So depending on how intense the integration is of the value chain, whether domestic or international, um, you are in a better position to respond to the rules of origin. Typically, rules of origin for manufactured goods have to deal with value addition and in some cases change of tariff heading, at different levels. So it will be easier, in my view, for countries like India, which have strong domestic, value chains, to comply with the rules of origin that the US may put in place. The rules are not yet, published, so we don't know what kind of rules of origin are going to be applied. But so I think the opportunities for us will depend on that. And my advice to businesses would be to, on the lookout and be very alert about where the opportunities are, which trading partners of the US are perceived to be friendly, where you can relocate some of the manufacturing. There's been talk about relocating some manufacturing from India to Mexico, for example, or to other destinations that are closer to the US and that are also perceived to be US friendly. There's going to be some offshoring of manufacturing from China and a cohort of countries to India. We've already seen, there's some news about ramping up smartphone production in India by some of the foreign players because they perceive that the policy landscape is stable and there are certain advantages they've already reaped here. So I think um, because the situation is very dynamic, it's difficult to say uh, to what extent we'll be able to tap into the China plus one factor. But I think if the current Chinese tariffs were to stay, then the kind of advantage, competitive advantage that we get is quite substantial. And so it should not be that difficult for Indian businesses to put their act together and respond to this in a favorable way. So I do look at it that way.
And so we've seen the US, use tariffs not just economically but diplomatically. Essentially saying play by our rules or we pay the price, right? How should India navigate this rising pressure without losing its strategic autonomy?
There has to be some give and take. And it's going to be a complex negotiation. The bilateral trade agreement that we do with the US, in my view, is going to be a complex negotiation for two reasons. One, the starting point for the US is that there's a trade imbalance which needs to be bridged. Um, so does it mean that the trade agreement that you finally sign up on has to be more favorable to the US? Or does it mean that it has to be equally poised or maybe slightly tilted in the US's favor? We don't know. So those are the ground rules with which you have to begin. Um, Also, will it be confined to tariffs? Um, how deep will it sort of go in terms of the extent of tariff? And secondly, in terms of market access for agriculture. That's a difficult one for India to handle. What kind of products, would India, would the US be interested in? Um, the third thing which happens, which we have to be mindful of, is what it does to the services sector. And if you're not able to give enough comfort to the US in terms of goods, which are the services where the US has a deep interest? One is hearing about banking, insurance, and some of the sectors that have been talked about in the USTR's report. How far are we able to liberalize our quality control orders or to dismantle some of them? Um, our regime for setting standards. The US is alleging that our standards are not in conformity with international standards, and we've not been able to justify why they're not so and why we need stiffer standards in India. So, I mean, these are some of the concerns. The way IPR is enforced in India, shutdown of the internet from time to time. These are some of the issues, difficult ones, which the US has been raising. So it's going to be a complex negotiation. Um, but I'm at the same time quite sanguine that the government of India will obviously work out an agreement that is in the interest of both parties.
We heard the FM. I think just a couple of days ago, she said that our policy environment is very agile to uh, you know handle the situation. Do you think our trade policy architecture is really agile enough to respond to this kind of transactional geopolitics that we are witnessing?
Um, we don't take too much time in sort of changing our trade policy in response to international developments. That has been my experience, whether it's tariffs or non-tariff measures. On top of that, what has happened now is that in the Department of Commerce, I read, in the media that they've set up a monitoring cell which is looking at
Yes.
how trade flows are behaving and whether the government needs to step in with any policy initiatives. So I think our system on trade policy, because it's mainly confined to the center, we are able to respond quite promptly to changes in the world economy. In fact, we're accused of making very frequent changes to our trade policy.
Yes, we've seen plenty of that.
Yeah.
Um, if these tariff shifts continue, which sectors do you think they stand to gain the most, and which could take a hit? Perhaps those very heavily dependent on imports from China or sensitive to retaliatory duties. What's your view?
Um, Look, I call the situation dynamic from 2 points of view. So one is that there is these tariffs which our exporters will need to face in the US market. The other, of course, which has been talked about by many commentators, is that some of the export engines of the world are sitting on a huge inventory of manufactured goods, which they would like to offload in different markets wherever they're able to find access. So, uh, when you ask the question whether we are able to capitalize on this, I think strategically what we should be looking at is whether we are able to uh, convert the possibility of offloading of huge inventories sitting in China and other countries into by way of lower prices for our inputs that go into our export production and thereby improving our competitiveness. Would we be able to negotiate? Would our manufacturers be able to negotiate that kind of deal better? Given the current circumstances, or so that's one leg of it. The other thing which will determine which sectors will take a hit, of course, depends on what is the export concentration in that sector, the nature of goods. For example, if you were to compare and two major exports from India to the US, one is gems and jewelry, and the other is pharma. Now, India happens to be one sort of offshore destination for the US, which has the largest number of FDA approved manufacturing facilities outside the US. So that's why we're major exporters of pharma to the US. Now, pharma is an essential, and therefore it's going to have a low, demand, price elasticity of demand. As a result, the importers in the US, uh, it's, I mean, the tariffs in the US are not going to impact the pharma sector very, very unfavorably, I feel. But gems and jewelry, on the other hand, is basically a discretionary purchase. So the price elasticity of demand is obviously going to be high. And in my view, therefore, it's likely to be very adversely impacted. Um, so yeah, it will depend on the nature of the goods, and it will depend on the export concentration in that particular sector and the extent to which the US is dependent on imports from India for that sector.
So, speaking about our domestic taxes, could GST policy tweaks or faster refund mechanisms help cushion the blow or enhance sectoral competitiveness?
Yes, of course. If there are any roadblocks, that exporters face in securing, refunds of IGST or input tax credit when they export, uh, and we're able to remove them, that will definitely help exporters because their, capital is not blocked and they're able to turn it around quicker. Likewise, for other export incentives that, customs authorities enforce, it could be drawback, it could be, other benefits that DGFT provides. So, yes, those need to be handled.
And Mr. Jory, coming back to the macro view, so there's real concern building up that Trump's erratic tariff moves and the global debt pressures and fragmented diplomacy. So these could trigger a recession-like slowdown. So, from your perspective, how prepared is the Indian economy and its tax framework to ride out this wave? First of all, do you see this wave coming up?
Yes, of course. Um, because of the uncertainty, because of the pushback on exports, even though it may be short term, and 90 days is not that short term for the global economy. And if trade slows down, and trade is one of the engines of growth, obviously it's going to impact the overall growth of the economy. If economies that are mainly export led, uh, and it couldn't be a matter of coincidence that in the current round of tariff hikes that the US has deployed, most of the economies that are very majorly sort of hit are the ones that are export led, and they're the ones who are running a deficit with the US. So the impact on those is going to be very, very high compared to others. And to the extent they've been contributing to global growth, the impact on global growth on account of these economies slowing down will also be that much more. So it's a given that there will be, a slowdown globally. How we are able to deal with it, as I mentioned earlier, because we do not have such heavy export dependence on others, we are insulated to some extent, but not completely. Um, because we're at an advanced stage of negotiation with the EU and UK and others in doing an FTA, we would be in a better position to find newer markets. We already have many FTAs where the concern is that the rate of utilization is not high enough. Indo-ASEAN, for example, we are running a deficit. We need to close that. So there are areas where a little bit of policy tweak and effort on the part of exporters and government and chambers of commerce would help us, you know, ride this.
Just extending, what we just spoke about, the global recession and the global impact. So we have a lot of experts warning that we could be inching towards a period of, not much unlike the 1930s, where trade nationalism, economic despair, political brinkmanship led the world into an armed conflict. Now, that may sound alarmist, but with the great power rivalries, hardening and institutions like WTO being undermined, Do you think there's any merit to these fears?
I'm I'm not so sure whether it'll actually culminate in armed conflicts, but economic warfare, yes, plenty of it. You already see, um, you know, a parallel narrative being built of, um, and in fact, it's not just a narrative; it's actually happening on the ground of coming up with new payment systems.
Yeah.
And trade finance as an alternative to the SWIFT system, the US dollar, and people are experimenting with that. Uh, India has also tapped into rupee trade with some of its trading partners. So I think it's a major churn. It's a reconfiguration of trade blocks of trading patterns of global value chains. But whether it's going to culminate in armed conflict, I'm not so sure. It's early days.
Yeah, conservative view there. Uh, so this brings us to the end of an interesting conversation, one that spanned trade tensions, policy pivots, the dynamic choices India must make in a fast-changing world. I think these have been very, very insightful. Mr. Jory, thank you so much for your sharp insights and for connecting the dots between economics, policy, and geopolitics. So, and to
Thank you.
us listeners, stay tuned, stay curious, and as always, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.